everybody to the Citizens Climate Lobby call tonight. I'll just give you a brief introduction to Dr. Amanda Cahill. She's the CEO of The Next Economy and she's the founder of the Centre for Social Change. She's spent nearly 25 years working with inspiring people all around the world to create positive change on issues as diverse as livelihoods and economic development, health and well-being, women's empowerment, and now a strong focus on climate change action. Over the last 5 years, she has been working with communities across Australia to strengthen regional economies by embracing the transition from fossil fuels to a zero emissions economy. Amanda has a PhD in Human Geography from the Australian National University and is an associate of the University of Queensland and the Sydney Policy Lab. Tonight, she will discuss a number of opportunities to act on deep-rooted community issues, sharing her strong experience from working in the regions across Australia to create a positive future. And I know Amanda from back in the day with Engineers Without Borders, so it's very exciting to connect with her in the climate space. And I, for one, am very excited to hear more from her about her work in the just transition space. And I'll hand over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, it's really great, actually. I go to a lot of sustainability focused things and I see Engineers Without Borders people everywhere. So it was a great organisation that worked with young people and really, I think, developed their leadership skills. So like people I knew as university students are now running, you know, the water systems in Melbourne or national policy, which is great.
And Engineers Without Borders itself is now working to get engineers to declare climate emergency. So it's good to see them engaged in the climate space too.
Yeah. And they've had a really good response, by the way, to that. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on, and they'll be different across Australia. I am here on Yagara and Turrbal land here in Brisbane, and I just want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and the fact that this land has never been ceded and there's ongoing First Nation sovereignty. So yes, I run The Next Economy. It's still a pretty new organisation. It's only been going for about 2 years. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and we set up to support communities struggling with economic change around how do they deal with that in a way that's actually good for people and the planet. So trying to cut through some of that jobs versus environment narrative. So what does social justice look like? What does environmental justice look like? And also people have good livelihoods at the same time. Most of the work in practice for the last 5 years, so even before The Next Economy, has been working with regional communities around Australia to explore the transition and the changes that we need to make around climate change as an economic opportunity. So what do we need to do to reduce and absorb emissions across all sectors, not just energy, but land use and transport and waste and buildings and manufacturing and processing. So I only just got back from Kingaroy, actually. I've just spent the last 2 days in Kingaroy where people, I was hosted by the Kingaroy Concerned Citizens group that's been fighting a coal mine that doesn't seem to be happening but just keeps hanging around. And they're kind of focused on, well, how do we shift the conversation from something that's oppositional to really starting to connect people across the growing divide around energy issues to focus on a more positive future. So that would be one example of the sort of work that I've been doing. I think I just want to talk, I want to focus most of the time I've got on what I've been noticing in terms of trends politically. So in terms of the public and how they're talking about transition or thinking about transition. But I've been having a crazy amount of meetings with politicians and public servants across state and federal government and local government since the election. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on what's actually coming through with them in talking about this issue. But I want to start by talking about how I got started, because I think it's quite instructive. 5 years ago, 2014, the coal price had been down for a couple of years. And Tim Buckley, who's a financial analyst who looks at coal markets, had been invited to Mackay to do a talk on international markets and where the future of coal was going. And it was the first time he'd done that talk in North Queensland and people listened because the coal price had been down. And I got a call from the organisers of the event saying, hey, look, they're listening, and I think we might be doing something really bad because we're saying the end is nigh, but we don't know what to, people are saying, what do we do about it? And we don't know. Don't you do this economic development stuff? Can you talk to people? And at that stage, I was just doing work overseas around supporting communities to lead their own economic planning. And these are places that were dealing with a lot of poverty and other issues. So it was very grassroots and participatory democracy techniques. And I was like, well, I do this overseas. I don't know how it's going to translate in Australia. And they said, don't worry about it. They're going to think you're a greenie. It's a one-off thing. Doesn't matter what you say. And I went, okay. And the opposite happened. When I got back to Brisbane, I got emails from the head of the Chamber of Commerce, Department of State Development, head of the sugarcane industry, people who would, and elected officials saying, don't tell anyone I'm talking to you. I'm not a greenie, but I care about my community and the economy. You make sense. Can you come back and talk to us about how do we plan for this transition? So I went back, organised 12 meetings, and within 5 days spoke to 54 people. And the thing that really hit me was how scared people were to talk about this. They were happy to, I was often the first person that they'd had an honest conversation with about the future of the coal industry and doubts around whether it was going to come back or not. This is 2014. And it stuck with me. It just really bothered me, the level of fear, because compared to other places I've been working, like the Philippines, Timor, Fiji, where there are some real issues with their democracy and real threats if you speak out against issues, I just couldn't see why people were so scared. Like, we have the technology, we know what we need to do, we have the resources. The worst hadn't hit yet in 2014, still hasn't. And I was like, we can do this. And we've got a government that has systems in place to encourage renewable energy. And for about 10 days, I was mulling on this. And then I was like, I couldn't get this thought out of my head that this is the sort of thing that led to Nazi Germany in the 20s and 30s, was economic hardship that is real, but it's the actual level of fear that drives pretty bad trends. And I turned on the news about 10 days later, and it was the first big Reclaim Australia rallies that were happening nationally, coordinated. They're an anti-immigration, anti-Muslim group, and one of the biggest was in Mackay, and it was led by the local MP. And in that moment, I just went, this is not happening in my country. Like, I need to focus on this issue. So what have we seen in the last 5 years since then? And not long after I was up in Mackay, I got phone calls from ministers in both the LNP and Labor. So ministers and shadow ministers saying, and union people saying, we heard you're in regional Australia. You know, what are they saying about transition? Are they ready yet? And I said, yes, you've got a political mandate to talk about this, because people are saying, where are you? Where is the plan? The leader that stands up and says, okay, we don't have all the answers, but we do need to think about this. Eventually, we're going to have to think about what we're going to do about the coal industry, because people accept that there is a finite time around this. They don't know when, but just to start to have that conversation. And I was told across the board, oh no, we don't think people are ready to have that conversation. The polling says they're not ready yet. So it took Labor 5 years to then put a just transition policy to the electorate. And I think it was too late. And in that time period, we've seen One Nation come back, and we've seen some interesting other parties that have capitalised on the fact that people in regional areas are doing it tough. The level of distrust that they have in government, and that nobody seems to be, everyone's fighting about climate change, but nobody seems to have a plan or a positive action around it. So it's kind of been relegated to that climate change, that's too hard. I need to focus on my power bills because that's real to me and I can't manage that. So it was interesting because the first couple of years when I started going out to communities, I didn't actually get any opposition. Like, I was meeting often with government and industry leaders behind closed doors in an invitation roundtable discussions, as well as doing them public forums. And the response I would get, maybe people were a bit hesitant at first, but very quickly when I started talking about, okay, we need to reduce and absorb emissions. It doesn't matter whether you believe in climate change or not, the rest of the world is moving. And our energy system needs to change because our coal-fired plants are old and we need to replace them with something. And very quickly people were like, oh, okay, well that makes sense. Why isn't anyone talking about this? Then I'd get them to map out all the things that they were doing regionally, especially with the roundtable meetings. And actually people could see that already there's a lot going, whether it's energy efficiency initiatives in buildings, or local governments building their own solar plants, or different kind of agricultural initiatives. There's actually heaps going on, and people go, oh, all right, we can build on that. There's something to work with there. Things changed this year. I really know it's been a lot harder doing this work this year. So people like in Townsville have been up there, worked up there now for over 2 years, and been back multiple times, and had very good relationships with people like the Economic Development Officer and Council, the Regional Development Authority person, and they have always been very supportive at getting people to events and encouraging people to talk about this. But when we had a public forum just before the federal election, I got 3 separate emails from women in particular who said, you know, we love your work and we always promote you, but we can't this time. It's just too risky, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, or if people see me at this forum, I don't know what's going to happen. And that was telling, that something had really shifted. And the rest of the forums that we've done regionally, even since the election, apart from Kingaroy was excellent, because there are people there who kind of accept the transition is inevitable and want to do something about it. Most of them have been pretty hard work, and the sense is that people feel that they have to pick a side. The level of activism in some ways is good because it means people are talking about the issue, but there's a lot of identity politics caught up in this, where people feel like they're under attack, and that they've been abandoned by government. They're under attack by these people who come in from the outside, these greenies who tell us, well, you know, that we should be different somehow. So it's become harder to find that space in the middle that people used to go, that's common sense. The other thing, I guess, that makes it a bit hard at the moment is, and I'll talk about positive stuff too, but the other, just for context, is renewable energy. So Australians tend to love renewable energy, especially when you're talking about solar panels on roofs. But there's increasingly the rollout of very large scale renewable energy projects, some of which aren't done particularly well. They're not even doing the basics around consulting with communities. There's not a lot of regulations and planning in place for councils to control where the projects are being built. The companies aren't necessarily thinking about how they put money back into the community, even if it is sponsoring the football team. Like, those things aren't being done. And so there are whole areas of central Queensland where people are telling me that coal seam gas has a better social license than renewable energy does, which I think is really interesting. So we've kind of got this. I think people overwhelmed thing. We don't even know where to start to think about it. And then the people are focusing on renewable energy, and then there's conflict that's starting to brew around that. So even the good solution is starting to look a bit murky. So all of this is leading to people just generally not trusting government in particular, and a lot of also concerns about health and pollution. So what is actually helping to people move at the moment is what I found is talking about renewable energy and acknowledging the challenges with it, but then saying, well, what do you want and where do we need to go with it? So actually activating people going, well, this is how ideally we would like this to happen. Health and pollution issues are coming up as a big issue that people are concerned about, which I have to admit I'm surprised about. There's been some campaigns focused on that, and I didn't think they were going to work. But even in areas where there's been coal fire stations for a long time or other kind of industry, people are starting to see, yes, there's been a cost for living in this area, and we expect more. And so that's another issue that is cutting through. I think another opportunity is how to actually start making visible the scale and the range of things that are actually happening at a regional level that is already helping the transition. So industry is already doing things like Sun Metals, which is a metal refinery in Townsville, built their own solar farm because of energy prices. Some of the power companies are behind closed doors and coming to me saying, in particular, acknowledging that they know that they're going to have to shut their doors in the next 10 years, and they need to start figuring out how they're going to do that. And they're turning up to community meetings and starting to talk to people. So how do we make what is happening that is good possible and visible, I think is incredibly powerful. And that has been cutting through with politicians across the board as well. It's the stories around where regions are getting organised, where investment is flowing, where there are really big projects that, you know, that have involved lots of money and lots of jobs, but also the smaller initiatives around community energy or different kind of agriculture projects or food initiatives. I think the lesson for me is we forget how little politicians in particular know about what's going on. And it's been quite shocking to me. Like, I keep thinking, what can I tell them? And then I walk away from a meeting and they're like, just a minute, can you send us the example or a photo of that? Or do you have a report about what you were saying about coal investment being down 75% globally over the last 3 years? So coming in armed with stories and where the solutions are, and what people are concerned about and what they want action on and what that looks like. I have found a lot of very willing ears amongst politicians, including people like the Deputy Premier of Queensland, the head of the opposition in Queensland, senators at a federal level. So now is the time to be talking about transition and what that looks like. The interesting thing in the block is every meeting is yes, 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 and this is amazing and it's good, but we don't think we've got the public behind us yet. So my role, particularly in Queensland and lead up to election next year, is to be doing a lot more public facing events and showing the politicians that there is social license and community support for them to actually stand up and do what they know is the right thing. I'm tired of having conversations where politicians saying, yes, yes, we know, we accept the climate science, but we don't think the polling's there yet. So how we can mobilise people, and I think your organisation is great, but then going in and saying, actually, we represent lots of people who actually want you to do the right thing, and we're looking for leaders to stand up and do that. Yeah, but I might just leave it there and leave it for questions. And hopefully that made sense.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was really fascinating and very insightful, and I'm sure great food for thought for people on the call and people who will be listening at a later time. It's interesting how you mentioned that power companies would be closing in the next 10 years. I guess that's something companies have to think about in their life cycle, is closing down, and I wonder what that means for investors and people.
Well, that's all public information. So that they have to, like, basically it's based on the life cycle of a plant. So they're either built for 50 years or 40 years, depending on how new they are. The newer ones are actually built for 40 years or less operation. And so the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, might have got that acronym slightly wrong, has published all of those dates around when they're due for retirement. But over the last 10 years, we've had 10 power stations close earlier than that date, that end of life date. So, you know, they all know that that's coming. And then we had AGL with Liddell come out proactively and say that they were going to actively close earlier. They've been politically caned for that, but they are still going ahead, and they're starting to engage with community and their workers around that. So that's an interesting one, because, you know, the energy companies don't want to come out and say this, but at the same time, everyone knows that they know that. So it's about half of our fleet have to retire in the next 10 to 15 years, and we have to replace it with something. And renewable energy, new renewable energy, is way cheaper. There's one study, Bloomberg Finance, saying it's 50% cheaper to replace it. So with renewable, with solar and wind, with different firming technologies, whether that's pumped hydro or battery storage or other things. So the economics stack up, and the power companies know that. The interesting thing in Queensland at the moment is 2/3 of our power stations are owned by the government. So the government has a lot more control and around some of those closure issues. But the unions are making that difficult. Some of the unions, not all of the unions. Some of the unions are very much talking about transition. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on with the union movement around this as well.
I bet there is. So I've got a couple of questions up my sleeve that I would love to ask Amanda, but I feel like I should open it up to questions from other people on the call. And if you're not asking a question, if you could stay muted, but if there's anyone who's got a question.
Yes, I have actually. I'm Jennifer Hole from Western Australia, and coal-fired power stations aren't so much a feature here for our energy. We've only got one really, but well, I was talking about natural gas, which is a relatively more recent industry, and there's been, trumpeted as a way of transitioning, from coal to renewables, and how we can sort of get a conversation going about the eventual end of that, given that it does produce a lot of emissions.
Yeah, that's it. Western Australia is a particularly interesting case too, because everywhere else the gas is really expensive, but you've got your, what's it called? The Western Australia government
domestic reservation policy.
Reservation policy, yeah. So that's made it, that was going to make it a very difficult campaigning issue. Tim Buckley, so I was in Kingaroy last night with Tim Buckley, and he made a really good point around gas. What he did is he showed a slide from General Electric's and basically made the point that in, I'm going to get this wrong in terms of the numbers, but I'll give you the general gist, that they were the biggest company in the world in 2000, and within they invested a lot in gas and nuclear, but mostly in gas turbine production. They were making the gas turbines. They lost $200 billion. They were worth $600 billion in 2000. Between 2016 and 2018, you're gonna have to check these figures, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. They lost $200 billion in share market shareholder wealth because they bet on gas, and the market demand for for new gas equipment, the gas industry had halved, fell by 50%. And so they've just lost so much money. So he sees that as indicative of where the market's going and where investment is flowing. And as particularly in Australia, his point was that gas is so expensive that it doesn't make sense. If you're choosing between renewables versus gas, you'd invest in renewables because they're cheaper. There's a lot of discussion around the fact that while we're pushing for 100% renewable energy, the more conservative pundits would say we'll probably get to like 80 to 90% renewable energy, and we'll need something to fill that gap. Will that be gas? But by the time we get there, there's probably going to be other technologies and other ways to firm it up. So, and other storage techniques. So I don't know that anyone's going to push gas as a replacement for coal, but it's going to be a fight around how long that is going to be in play, I think. So, but yeah, Western Australia is tougher because you've got the reserve. That doesn't mean, it's just another issue. The really good campaign around gas is in the Northern Territory around trying to stop the fracking from happening, and it's being led also by First Nations groups, and it's really exciting, and they're getting a lot of cut through.
Thank you.
Just got a question in the chat. I'm just going to have a look.
Hydrogen.
Any comments on hydrogen, Amanda?
Yeah, I spent a couple of days in Melbourne 3 weeks ago with a whole lot of technical people talking about hydrogen. So there's the federal government's putting a whole lot of money into a national hydrogen strategy at the moment, which is interesting because they often say it's not our business to tell industry what to do, but with this one, they're putting a whole lot in. It's being pushed as the replacement export owner, because you can export effectively renewable energy by producing hydrogen and ammonia. And the sort of view is that where we got to so basically what was happening in Melbourne was there was a high level delegation of German government and industry trade meeting with high level government industry in Australia, because Germany's getting to a point where they're going to max out on how much renewable energy they can build because of land and transmission issues. So they are going to have to import hydrogen for not just the things that you can't electrify, because there are some things that are very difficult to electrify, like a lot of transport, for example, where you're going to need some sort of liquid fuel to replace that. So you could either go gas, you could go hydrogen gas. So there's so basically Germany was saying, we're going to have, we've maxed out, we're going to max out on how much renewable energy. So we're going to need a replacement fuel. We're going to have to import that from somewhere else. And we're looking at Australia because you're a stable democracy. Plus you've got a lot of the infrastructure because of the LNG developments and the CSG developments, and the port facilities are actually suited to then producing hydrogen. So if we've got excess sun and wind, we can actually use that energy. So we shouldn't be talking about 100% renewable energy in Australia. We should be talking about 200% renewable energy in Australia, so that we're actually
700. Someone's saying
700. Yeah, on the chat line, that was Nikki the other day. So we can actually be producing renewable energy for export. The danger at the moment is when you think about it as an industry, from a capitalist point of view, it's something you can capture. It's expensive. You need big infrastructure to do it. You can set the price around it. So it's very attractive to business right now. So the danger is that we don't look at hydrogen as what it should be used for, which is for countries that can't do that much renewable energy, or for things that can't be electrified. And we buy into this idea that we can use hydrogen for our own electricity, which we don't need to do because we've got enough. And then, and Luke's saying there's a special webinar, Introduction to Hydrogen. Excellent, good. From people who are more technically savvy than I am. October 30, great.
There's one question I'd like to ask Amanda while we've still got you on the line. You get invited into all of these communities. You don't enter them without an invitation. But what can we as Citizens Climate Lobby members do to help bring that conversation forward? Because we're probably not going to get those invitations to communities the way that you are. Is there something that we can do to help maybe bring it up with our MPs or something like that?
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it. I guess what you could do is put it on the agenda that, or mention to them that there's a number of groups that already are working in regional areas and talking to people on the ground and getting a lot of interest. So it's not just the next economy, but yep, throw a name in there. And I am getting a lot of interest from people I've never even heard of, didn't know that they were elected officials, contacting me saying, somebody said that you were doing this, can I talk to you and figure out how to talk to regional Australia? Which is kind of offensive in itself to regional Australia. But also Farmers for Climate Action are great. Lock the Gate are doing some really great work in the Hunter. So do your work on who is already out there, because they've got the relationships in place, and encourage the MPs to talk to them and find out more. And talk to those groups and say, you know, if you had a message when we're going into Parliament, what do you want us to say to them? Or get their advice, because they often do a lot of lobbying as well. So they'll know what cuts through from the work that they're doing.
Sounds good.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Amanda, just be useful for us to hear just what you're saying about the actual nuts and bolts of the transition. Are you just talking about, you know, fossil fuels are on the way out and sooner or later we'll be all renewables, but there's a lot of detail in there about how that transition occurs, and to what extent are you talking about some of those details, and what is it that's reassuring to some of these people about that process? Because you know, obviously one of the things we're up against is the fear of change. You know, people find it really hard. You know, there's this natural resistance to change, and clearly you're giving success stories, and that helps. But what else are you saying that's sort of enabling people to understand?
I think there's three things. I was thinking about this last night when we were in Kingaroy, because I've done enough of them now. I sort of went, oh, there's a bit of a pattern here. So one is, which I didn't have to do last night because Wendy from the Latrobe Valley was there as well, up in Kingaroy, talking to a community that's probably going to have a power station closure at some point. So telling the stories of, especially the Latrobe Valley, because it's actually a lot of good news stories there about how they've recovered from Hazelwood. There's actually more people in employment now than there were before Hazelwood shut.
Wow.
Yeah, people don't know. See, we don't know. We don't hear the good stuff.
Yeah.
And that they've got a electric vehicle plant that has just signed, that, you know, was planned for light vehicles, not passenger, like normal cars, so small vans and things like that. And they've just signed a deal with a company in the US that is their first order. So it's going ahead, and they've committed to producing 500 jobs. So telling some of those stories, talking about Port Augusta, that there was community got organised around concentrated solar thermal even before the power station shut. It wasn't about the power station closure. They just thought concentrated solar was good. They've now got 12 projects being renewable energy projects being built because the community got organised and wanted it. Talking about Indi with the 17, right, Luke? Community energy projects in the region and how that really got people participating. So that's part one, tell those stories, and that it is already happening, and communities and governments are already dealing with it, and industry is adapting. So we can think about it in advance instead of waiting for things to close. That would be a better outcome. That's number one. Number two, what I do is I do a general I don't do this in every presentation, but depending on where people are at, I do a presentation where I map out really high level, what do the jobs look like if we reduce and absorb emissions across all sectors to help us get to where we need to get to, which is reducing at least by 50% by 2030. And I just tell stories about, you know, so what does that look like in agriculture? It's not just planting trees or protecting from clearing. There's also really interesting renewable energy projects on the farms to drought-proof farms. There's biofuels, there's all sorts. So I just kind of map out, kind of list the jobs under each sector, and it just gets people's imagination, and I throw in examples as I go, showing that it's already happening. It's not just a future thing. The third thing I do is, and this is a presentation all in itself as well, is actually get people to understand, okay, how do we get there? What's the process in between of managing the transition? And I see that as 6 parts. So one is making sure we've got energy security and it's affordable. That's generally where the discussion stops. We've got to talk about workforce issues, how we manage that change over a long period of time and all the different parts of that. It's how do we diversify regional economies so they're actually more resilient anyway? How do we help industry to adapt and actually get industry strategies so that they actually, and we're talking about infrastructure development and the investment that they need. How do we look after marginalised groups? So groups that are already marginalised by the economy, and actually see this as an opportunity to address justice issues. So whether they're low income households that get access to cheap renewable energy instead of being hit with high power bills, whether it's First Nations groups actually being financially rewarded for sequestering carbon, which they're already doing. So how do we look after marginalised groups? And I'm missing a point. I can't remember what number 6 is. Oh, rehabilitation. So how do we look at the rehabilitation of sites? And usually at that point, I talk about the fact that I think one of the things that we've done very poorly in Australia that Germany didn't do, what Germany did was they actually celebrated the coal miner. They acknowledged that things were changing, but they also acknowledged that they were a powerhouse of Europe based on electricity built on coal. And so they've culturally embraced that and celebrated and been grateful for that. So how do we, it's not just rehabilitation in terms of just pushing things out, it's actually kind of going, okay, well, yes, now it's time to move on. So I show a picture of a power plant that has right in the middle of it, that's been closed, a swimming pool and an ice rink, which is a World Heritage listed site. So yeah, we can be more creative about how we manage this. But I've probably taken up too much of your time.
Not at all. That's great. Thank you.
So that is almost pretty much the end of the time that Amanda has been so generous to give us. There is one more question here. Is there any skills issue for new jobs? Recent research from Anglicare says that there is only 1 in 5 entry-level jobs available.
Is that across the board, or is that specifically around energy transition jobs?
Rose, have you got any more info on that? Across the board.
Yeah, so there's a big issue, and this is what I said to the Deputy Premier of Queensland. It's like, it wasn't that people voted against the climate. It's the fact that people are in really shitty jobs and really precarious work conditions. So it says, yeah, it's higher, and it's high in regional areas, and it's higher for youth, and it's higher for young people and Indigenous groups, and older workers. So the really interesting thing most people don't know is when they say the stats are like 5% unemployment, which is supposedly full employment, they're supposed to always naturally have a certain proportion of population unemployed. They actually changed the definition of what employment means. So it's more than half of workers are actually in casual part-time positions now. I think the definition of it actually employed is something like 4 hours a week. Luke's probably going to know more about this than me. So that basically counting people as employed that really don't have decent conditions. So there's definitely an issue around work, and there's increasing automation coming down the line. And we need to be putting pressure on politicians to actually see that as an opportunity to look at working conditions. Should we be looking at shorter working hours, which some countries in Europe are doing? Should we be looking at universal basic income? Should we be looking at universal services guarantees? There's bigger questions around the nature of work. And interestingly, I might start talking about the coal transition, but we end up talking about these other issues, which I think is a good thing. There's like, people are angry. They start up talking about empty shops in towns. Why can't farmers sell their vegetables to whoever they want? So this, yeah, there's bigger issues that we need to deal with.
Can I just make a really quick comment about like Rose's question, and jobs and training? If people are interested to have a look at the ACTU, they did a just transition document a couple of years ago, and federal Labor have a policy of a just transition authority, which they may be pulling back at the moment from, I'm not sure. But the idea is basically at a place-based level, so at the community level, doing an assessment of what are the jobs needs, and looking at retraining and so on, and that being a key component. And this is where the role of unions, so like I said at QCOS, we're a peak body. We represent a whole bunch of members or organisations. Their staff members belong to a bunch of different unions. So if they all spoke to their unions about what we're doing in the face of just transition, there's another narrative to try and, put back on the agenda for Labor, who in Queensland, they've got a just transition group in Treasury, but they're a bit scared of it because of the federal election outcomes, where they're actually given on a gold platter a massive opportunity to use that to talk, in my opinion, to talk to their communities around the opportunities for those communities at their, on their doorstep. And that doesn't mean, there's going to be some communities where there will be a loss in the movement of jobs, i.e. the coal affected communities. But I do think there's an opportunity there to support Labor in their transition authority idea, which came from the ACTU.
Yeah, that's great, Luke. Thank you. Yeah, they need some encouragement. We need to be saying, yes, this is really great what you did, and we don't want to lose that. That's actually really good work. Because in 2016, they were all for it, and the head of the CFMEU, Tony Ma, did a speech saying he saw his job as palliative care for the coal industry. They launched it down in Old Parliament House, and then in 2017, they totally backtracked on it and went silent. So, and then they feel that they've gone bold again with the federal election by putting it out there, and they feel that they've gotten slammed, but I think their analysis is wrong. So we need to be like backing in positive feedback on that. Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Yeah, well, I am just aware that we have gone over time a little bit for our fantastic presentation and all of the questions. I'm sure people may have some further questions moving forward. So I imagine, I don't know, Amanda, if you'd just like to give a little quick plug to your website or anything.
Yep, so the website is www.nexteconomy.com.au, and you can sign up there. Or you can just send me an email at a.carl, which is CAHILL at nexteconomy.com.au. And I've just employed a new admin person, so I actually have a higher chance of getting back to you than I would normally.
Congratulations.
Thanks for having me, and good luck. I think what you're doing is really, really important. Like, we need to keep showing up and talking to them face to face, and it really does help. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thanks, Patty.